No one at the luxurious hotel could understand the mysterious Chinese millionaire. The staff whispered, joked, and ignored her requests. But everything changed when a simple maid unexpectedly spoke to her in fluent Chinese. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. The morning sun spilled through the blinds of Nia Carter's tiny apartment, casting narrow stripes of light across the threadbare couch and the modest table where her uniform lay neatly folded. She had ironed it the night before, the same way she always did. Precise creases, buttons polished, shoes lined up perfectly beneath. There was something about the routine that steadied her, even if it didn't change where she was headed. 4 years she had worked at the Grand Imperial Hotel, one of Los Angeles' most exclusive establishments, and in all that time, her role had never shifted beyond the invisible ranks of housekeeping. Nia moved quietly through her morning, brewing coffee in the chipped machine she had bought secondhand, buttering 2 slices of toast and glancing at the clock. The bus was always on time, and so was she. Punctuality had been drilled into her since her first day at the hotel, where mistakes were not met with a second chance, but with the cold note of a manager's disapproval. By the time she stepped out into the bustling street, the weight of the day ahead pressed down on her shoulders in its familiar, measured way. The bus ride into the heart of the city was a half-hour of jostling bodies and muted chatter. Nia kept to herself, as she always did, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery, a blur of storefronts, traffic lights, and pedestrians who looked as if they were rushing towards something important. She had learned to recognize the moment when the city's tone shifted. The graffiti-covered walls gave way to polished glass facades. The sidewalks widened, and the air seemed to hum with a wealthier, more deliberate rhythm. This was the district of the Grand Imperial, where luxury was not merely sold but performed. Inside the staff entrance, the air was different, cooler, less perfumed, tinged faintly with cleaning chemicals and the metallic scent of industrial kitchens. The corridors for employees were narrow and painted in an unremarkable beige, as if to remind the staff that their world was a separate one from the opulence upstairs. Nia's footsteps echoed lightly as she made her way to the locker room. The break room was already loud when she arrived, filled with the clatter of coffee mugs and the overlapping voices of her colleagues. Several of the senior housekeepers stood in a loose circle, exchanging the morning's gossip. Nia offered a polite nod as she passed, but their conversation carried on without pause. She had long ago learned her place here. She was tolerated, sometimes overlooked, and occasionally the subject of whispered remarks when she was just out of earshot or when they thought she was. "Always so serious," she had heard one of them say once, not even lowering her voice. "Like she thinks she's better than us." Nia never confronted them. The truth was simpler and far less dramatic. She preferred silence. The job demanded enough of her without the added strain of navigating the undercurrents of workplace politics. After changing into her crisp uniform, she headed upstairs through the service elevator. The doors opened to a hallway lined with thick carpet, the kind that muffled footsteps and seemed to absorb sound. Here, the Grand Imperial's face to the world began. In the public spaces, every detail was a statement. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, chandeliers dripping with crystal, arrangements of lilies and orchids refreshed daily. Guests glided through these halls with the easy assurance of those accustomed to being served without question. For the staff, the rules were clear. Move quietly, avoid unnecessary conversation, anticipate needs before they were voiced. Above all, remain invisible unless directly addressed. Nia excelled at all of these. which made her both valued by management and forgettable to almost everyone else. The morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, stripping beds, replenishing toiletries, wiping down gleaming bathroom surfaces until they reflected light like still water. The work was physical, but it had a rhythm, and in that rhythm, Nia found a kind of focus that kept the hours from dragging. Her mind wandered, as it sometimes did, to the languages she'd once studied in school. Most people at the hotel knew she spoke English and some Spanish. No one here knew she also spoke Mandarin. It had been years since she'd used it regularly. As a child, she had lived in a neighborhood where cultures intersected like threads in a tapestry. Their downstairs neighbor, Mrs. Liu, had looked after Nia when her mother was working late shifts. In those afternoons filled with the aroma of jasmine tea and the soft cadence of Chinese folk songs, Nia had learned not just words but the tones and rhythms of Mandarin. By the time she moved away at 16, the language had become a quiet part of her, something she carried without fanfare or purpose. It was just before her lunch break when the first wave of whispers began circulating among the staff. The manager had announced that a VIP guest was arriving later that day, a woman of immense wealth from China, said to have business interests in multiple countries and a reputation for exacting standards. Her name was Madame Maid. Nia listened quietly as others speculated. Some claimed they'd heard she traveled with priceless antiques. Others rolled their eyes, already bracing for the demands of a wealthy traveler. By mid-afternoon, the hotel seemed subtly transformed. There was a heightened energy in the lobby, a sharpened attentiveness in the staff's movements. The concierge's smiles seemed just a little brighter, the bellhops straighter in their stances. Nia, returning fresh towels to the laundry, caught a glimpse of the front entrance through a side corridor just as the long black limousine pulled up. The car door opened, and Madame Zhang emerged. She was striking tall, poised, with a presence that seemed to gather the light around her. Her attire was impeccable, a silk coat in deep jade, the collar embroidered with intricate golden thread, her hair arranged in a style that was both elegant and severe. Behind her, two porters struggled under the weight of her luggage, which included several gleaming designer suitcases and two lacquered wooden trunks that looked like they belonged in a museum. She stepped into the marble-floored lobby, her heels clicking softly, and addressed the doorman in a clear, composed voice. Mandarin Nia recognized instantly, the words flowing with precise intonation. The doorman froze for a split second before recovering his smile and gesturing toward the reception desk. He didn't understand her. From her vantage point, Nia watched the small but telling exchanges. Madame Zhang's expression remained unreadable as she approached the front desk, but her words were met with the same polite incomprehension. The receptionist smiled too brightly, speaking slowly in English, repeating herself when the guest didn't respond. The scene played out like a performance where neither actor knew the other's lines. Nia didn't intervene. Not yet. It wasn't her place. She turned away, the image lingering in her mind as she returned to her duties. The day would end as it always did, with her slipping out the staff entrance and back into her own quieter world. But somewhere, in the calm and careful routine she had built, a small shift had begun. She didn't know it yet, but the arrival of Madame Zhang and the gap between her words and the hotel's silence was about to draw Nia out from the shadows she had so carefully maintained. And by the end of it, neither the Grand Imperial nor the people who worked within its gleaming walls would see her the same way again. The tension from the previous day had not dissolved overnight. When Nia arrived at the Grand Imperial the following morning, She sensed it the moment she stepped into the service corridors. There was a sharpness to the voices of her colleagues, a gleam in their eyes as they exchanged tidbits of gossip that seemed too delicious to keep to themselves. She didn't have to listen closely to know the subject. Madame Zhang had not yet been in the hotel for 24 hours, and already she was the center of every whispered conversation. By the time Nia reached the break room to hang her coat in the small locker, 2 housekeepers were leaning over a table, coffee mugs in hand, lowering their voices only when she stepped inside. They did not stop speaking, but their eyes flicked toward her, and the faintest smirk passed between them. She ignored it. She had long since learned that reacting only fed whatever unkindness they were inclined to share. The morning briefing from the housekeeping supervisor included a pointed reminder about the high-profile guest in the Magnolia Suite, though the details were vague. No one mentioned that this guest spoke no English. That much had been made clear to Nia yesterday, watching from the side corridor as Mandarin phrases dissolved into meaningless air in front of the reception desk. Upstairs in the public part of the hotel, the air was perfumed with the faint scent of orchids. The marble gleamed, the brass handrails polished until they mirrored the light. Yet beneath the pristine surface, the hotel's rhythm faltered in subtle ways. The front desk staff, usually so practiced in their calm, seemed strained. Bellhops exchanged looks when the guest approached, and Madame Zhang, for her part, carried herself with the same dignified posture as the day before, though the slightest tightening at the corners of her mouth suggested she had already endured more than a few frustrations. Nia passed through the lobby once during her rounds, delivering fresh linens to a cart. She caught fragments of the scene unfolding at reception. The guest stood with her phone in hand, pointing to the screen where what appeared to be a booking confirmation was displayed. The receptionist, Rebecca, a young woman with an overly bright smile, nodded as though she understood, though her brow was faintly furrowed. She repeated something in English, her tone growing louder as though volume could substitute for comprehension. A moment later, the concierge stepped in, his manner smooth but no more effective. He gestured toward the lounge and made an open-palmed motion, inviting the guest to sit. Madame Zhang's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She spoke again, her voice calm but insistent, and though Nia couldn't hear every word, she caught enough to recognize the gist. There was a mistake with her reservation date, and she was trying to clarify it. The exchange ended with the guest taking a seat in the tea lounge, her posture straight, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass windows. From where Nia stood in the shadow of the corridor, she could see the way other staff skirted the lounge, their smiles fading when they passed within earshot. Some didn't even look at the guest. Others cast sidelong glances, the kind that carried a mix of curiosity and judgment. It was later, in the service pantry, that Nia overheard the first overt ridicule. 2 waitresses from the lounge were restocking trays of teacups, talking in low voices that were pitched just high enough to be heard by anyone nearby. "She keeps waving her hands around like that's going to make me understand," one of them said, mimicking the motion with exaggerated flourish. The other laughed. "Probably her first time out of China," the second said. "All that money and not a clue how to behave here." Nia felt the heat rise in her chest. She busied herself with folding napkins, her fingers moving automatically as she listened to them carry on. "I mean, who travels without knowing English? And what's with those old trunks? She's got half the lobby talking." Shuriken. It was the kind of casual cruelty that slid so easily from one person to another, requiring no real thought, just the comfort of shared disdain. Nia had heard it before, directed at guests who spoke Spanish, at couples who dressed differently, at anyone who didn't fit the narrow mold of what the staff considered normal for the Grand Imperial. But something about this felt sharper, more dismissive, perhaps because she could understand exactly what Madame Zhang had been saying the entire time. The day wore on, and the slights multiplied. Room service delivered the wrong dishes twice. The temperature in the Magnolia Suite was left several degrees warmer than the request. A floral arrangement with strongly scented lilies was placed on the table, despite a clear instruction to avoid flowers with overpowering smells. Each time the guest tried to explain, and each time she was met with either feigned understanding or polite dismissal. In the staff dining room during lunch, the conversation turned into open mockery. Heather, a brash housekeeper who often took the lead in gossip, recounted a scene she'd witnessed that morning. "She's pointing at the thermostat like it's supposed to mean something to me," Heather said, rolling her eyes, "and talking a mile a minute in Chinese. I just nodded and left. Let her call downstairs if it's so important." Laughter rippled around the table. Nia kept her eyes on her plate. The sound of their laughter pressed in on her like a weight. Each chuckle a reminder of the fine line she walked between invisibility and attention she did not want. Still, a thought had begun to take shape in the back of her mind, unwelcome but persistent. If she could just step forward and speak, she could make this easier for the guest at least. But stepping forward meant exposing something she had never shared here. It meant becoming visible in a way that could not be undone. And she knew all too well how quickly visibility could turn into a target. That afternoon, as Nia replenished towels on the 12th floor, she encountered the guest again. Madame Zhang was standing in the hallway outside her suite, speaking rapidly into her phone. Her voice carried a note of frustration that even the language barrier could not hide. She ended the call, slipped the phone into her bag, and stood there for a moment, her gaze distant. Nia hesitated at the end of the corridor, watching. The guest's composure was still intact, but there was a faint slump to her shoulders now, a weight that hadn't been there the day before. Downstairs in the service elevator, Nia found herself thinking of Mrs. Liu, the neighbor who had taught her Mandarin. She remembered the afternoon spent learning characters, the careful way Mrs. Liu had corrected her tones, the warmth in her eyes when Nia managed a sentence without stumbling. Those lessons had been more than language. They had been an opening into another world, one built on patience and understanding. In the Grand Imperial, there was no patience for what could not be instantly understood. No curiosity, only the shallow efficiency of moving problems along without solving them. By the time her shift ended, Nia felt the weight of the day in her bones. She walked past the tea lounge on her way to clock out. Madame Zhang was still there, seated alone, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. A cup of tea sat untouched, the steam long since faded. She was staring out at the darkening sky, her expression calm but distant, as though she were somewhere far beyond the confines of the lobby. Nia slowed her steps. There was an ache in her chest that she could not quite name. Something about the quiet isolation of that figure at the corner table felt achingly familiar. She turned away and continued toward the staff exit, telling herself it was not her place. Yet as she stepped out into the cool night air, the image stayed with her, following her home, lingering in her thoughts long after she had hung up her uniform. What she did not yet realize was that the point where empathy and silence met was already shifting inside her. That the moment when she would decide to break the quiet was coming sooner than she imagined, and when it arrived, it would change everything, for her, for Madame Zhang, and for the Grand Imperial itself. The following morning began like any other, but the atmosphere inside the Grand Imperial was taut, as if the air itself sensed an approaching disturbance. Nia arrived earlier than usual, the city streets still damp from a night rain that left the scent of wet pavement clinging to her clothes. The lobby was quieter than it had been the previous days, the hum of conversation low, yet there was an undercurrent of restlessness. She sensed it in the clipped exchanges between the receptionists, in the hurried footsteps of the concierge as he disappeared into the manager's office. Her first assignments were routine, replacing towels, delivering toiletries, checking minibars. She moved through the tasks with mechanical precision, but her mind was not in the work. The image of Madame Zhang from the evening before, sitting alone at the tea lounge, still haunted her. There had been something profoundly isolating about that moment, a quiet exile in the midst of luxury. And now, with the memory of the previous day's petty cruelties still raw, Nia felt a simmering unease that she could no longer ignore. Around mid-morning, she was summoned to deliver fresh linens to the Magnolia Suite. As she approached the door, she could hear voices inside raised, tense. One belonged to Madame Zhang, speaking rapid Mandarin, her tone sharp but controlled. The other was the clipped, exasperated English of the front desk manager, a man with a reputation for smoothing over problems only when it suited him. Nia hesitated, linens in hand, just outside the partially open door. The manager's voice carried clearly. "I told you, ma'am, we're doing our best, but we can't help if we don't understand you." His tone was polite in structure, but impatient in rhythm, the kind of voice meant to close a conversation rather than solve anything. From inside came a flurry of Mandarin. Though she spoke quickly, Madame Zhang's words were precise, each syllable landing with the weight of restrained frustration. Nia didn't need to hear every sentence to understand the essence. The suite's air conditioning had malfunctioned again overnight, and repeated calls for assistance had gone unanswered. The manager sighed audibly. "If you'll just call down to reception, we'll send someone when available." Nia's grip tightened around the linens. She knew exactly what was happening. He was using the same tactic others had, acknowledge the guest just enough to deflect her, without making any actual commitment to fix the problem. It was easier that way, safer, especially when dealing with someone whose voice carried the foreign lilt of another language. And then, without fully deciding to, she stepped forward and knocked gently on the doorframe. The manager turned, surprise flickering across his face when he saw her. "What is it?" he asked, a faint edge in his voice. "I can translate," Nia said simply. For a moment, there was only silence. The manager looked at her as though she had spoken in another language herself. "You speak Chinese?" Nia nodded. "Mandarin." The faint narrowing of his eyes was enough to reveal his skepticism, but he stepped aside. "Fine, go ahead." Nia turned to Madame Zhang, switching effortlessly into Mandarin. The guest's eyes widened in recognition, relief flashing across her features. She repeated her concerns, how the heat in the room had made it impossible to sleep, how she had called repeatedly, how she feared the pattern of being ignored would continue. Nia listened carefully, then turned back to the manager and relayed every detail, her voice steady, leaving nothing softened or altered. The manager's jaw tightened. He clearly didn't appreciate being exposed in front of a guest, but there was little he could do without making himself look worse. "We'll send maintenance immediately," he said. "Tell her that." When Nia translated, Madame Zhang's expression softened slightly. She inclined her head in a gesture of gratitude, though her eyes still carried the wariness of someone accustomed to disappointment. The manager lingered for another moment, then excused himself. As soon as the door closed behind him, Madame Zhang looked directly at Nia. In Mandarin, she asked, "Why did you help me?" Nia hesitated. "Because no one else would." The guest studied her for a moment, and then, with a small but genuine smile, she said, "You are the first person here who has listened." The rest of the morning unfolded differently. Maintenance arrived within 10 minutes, and the faulty air conditioning was repaired. Fresh flowers replaced the lilies with a simple arrangement of orchids. A fruit plate was delivered, along with tea prepared exactly to Madame Zhang's specifications. These gestures were transparent attempts by management to smooth things over now that the language barrier had been breached, but they still brought a faint light back to the guest's expression. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the staff. By lunchtime, Nia could feel the weight of eyes on her as she moved through the service quarters. Snippets of conversation followed her. Questions about how she had learned Mandarin, about why she hadn't mentioned it before. A few were impressed, but most carried the faint edge of resentment. In their world, standing out meant disrupting the hierarchy, and disruption was rarely welcomed. Heather cornered her in the break room later that day, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "So you've been holding out on us, huh? All this time, and you never thought to mention you're some kind of secret interpreter?" Nia simply shrugged. "It never came up." Heather's smile thinned. "Well, just be careful. You don't want people thinking you're trying to climb over them." The implication was clear. Nia had stepped out of the role assigned to her, quiet, invisible, replaceable, and now there would be a price for it. But even as she returned to her work, the faint fear in her chest was tempered by something else, something stronger. For the first time since she had started at the Grand Imperial, she felt that her presence had mattered. That afternoon, she passed the tea lounge again. Madame Zhang was there, but this time she beckoned Nia over. Switching between Mandarin and slow, careful English, she asked about her background, about where she had learned the language. Nia kept her answers brief, but there was a warmth in the conversation that felt rare in this place. When she left for the day, the cool evening air felt lighter than it had in weeks. She knew this wasn't the end, if anything. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name. But one thing was certain. She had crossed a threshold. The silence she had worn like armor was gone, and whatever came next, she would meet it with her voice, not her absence. What Nia didn't yet realize was that her decision to step forward had already begun to shift the balance inside the Grand Imperial. The guest who had been dismissed and ridiculed was no longer isolated, and that connection between them was about to draw them both into a current that neither the staff nor the management could ignore. The days following Nia's intervention seemed to unfold in a different light, though that light was fractured, casting both illumination and shadow. The Grand Imperial, with its polished marble floors and endless echoes of wealth, was still the same place, yet the atmosphere carried a new, almost imperceptible current. Staff members who once brushed past her without so much as a nod now looked twice, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. It was as if the invisible veil that had cloaked her had been lifted, not entirely by choice but by circumstance, and now there was no way to put it back. Her morning began as usual, with the ritual of clocking in, collecting the cleaning cart, and reviewing the day's assignments. But routine felt like a fragile mask. In the service corridors, she caught the tail ends of conversations that broke off the moment she appeared. The words translator, Chinese, and Madame Zhang floated in the air like faint traces of perfume. It was not praise she sensed, it was calculation, the silent tallying of what her unexpected usefulness might mean, and how it might disrupt the established balance among the staff. Madame Zhang, however, treated Nia differently. Each time they crossed paths, the guest greeted her warmly, either in Mandarin or in careful English, her tone holding a sincerity that seemed immune to the artifice surrounding them. There was no trace of the condescension so many guests carried when speaking to staff. Instead, there was curiosity and something else, an unspoken trust. On the third morning after the air conditioning incident, Nia was called to the Magnolia Suite again. This time, it was not for housekeeping. The request had come through the concierge stating that Madame Zhang wished to see her specifically. Nia hesitated before knocking, aware that such direct interaction outside her usual duties would be noticed. Inside, the suite was calm, the curtains drawn to filter the late morning sun into a soft golden wash over the room. Madame Zhang sat at the table, a porcelain tea set laid out between them. She gestured for Nia to join her. "You are different from the others here," Madame Zhang said in Mandarin, her tone quiet but firm. "They look at me and see only a problem to be managed. You listen. You understand. That is rare." Nia found herself smiling, a small, guarded gesture. "I just did what anyone should do." Madame Zhang shook her head. "No. Many people can help. Few choose to." The conversation shifted then, flowing into unexpected territory. Madame Zhang spoke of her late husband, of the business ties that had brought her to San Francisco, and of the memories she had of the city from decades past. Her words carried a certain heaviness, as though she were piecing together fragments of a personal history while navigating a present that felt increasingly alien to her. Nia listened, her own story silent but simmering beneath the surface. She did not share the full truth of her life, the years of quiet resilience, the dreams deferred by circumstance, but she offered pieces where they fit. They spoke of language as a bridge, of how understanding a person's words was more than just translating sounds. It was seeing their meaning. The meeting ended with a simple request from Madame Zhang. "If I need help again, I would like to call for you. Is that possible?" It was possible, though not without consequence. Staff assignments were controlled tightly, and favoritism, whether real or perceived, bred resentment faster than spilled wine on silk. But Nia agreed, knowing that refusal would feel like closing a door that had only just begun to open. By afternoon, the whispers had grown sharper. In the narrow hallway outside the staff break room, Nia overheard two housekeepers exchanging hushed words. "She's making herself too important," one said. "You know, management won't like it if a guest starts going around them." The other responded with a chuckle. "Or maybe she's smart. Maybe she knows something we don't." The unease was not confined to the staff. The front desk manager, who had been present during the original translation, began to appear in her peripheral vision more often, as though monitoring her movements. His polite greetings carried an edge now, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Late one evening, as she was finishing her shift, Nia encountered him in the lobby. The marble floors gleamed under the dim chandeliers, the air perfumed faintly with lilies from the arrangements flanking the entrance. He stepped into her path, his tone casual but calculated. "You've made quite an impression on one of our VIP guests. Just remember, Nia, impressions fade quickly. What lasts here is knowing your place." She met his gaze without flinching, but did not answer. Some battles were fought in words, others in silence. This one required the latter. Yet as the elevator doors closed behind her, she felt the shift within herself again. There was a quiet determination building, one that had been dormant for too long. She had not sought attention, but now that it had found her, she would not let it be twisted into something small. The following day brought another request from Madame Zhang, this time more urgent. She had received a complex document from overseas, written entirely in Mandarin, and needed someone she could trust to explain its contents. It was a matter of business, she said, but one that could not be left to just anyone. In the privacy of the suite, Nia read the document aloud in translation, careful to preserve the nuances of tone and implication. The details were intricate clauses about property rights, legal terms embedded within layers of formal politeness. By the time she finished, Madame Zhang was leaning back in her chair, eyes closed in thought. "You have helped me more than you know," the guest murmured, "and I suspect this is only the beginning." As Nia left the suite, she could feel the eyes of other staff members tracking her again. But this time, beneath the weight of their scrutiny, she carried something different. Not just the satisfaction of having been useful, but the knowledge that she was now part of a story much larger than the one she had been living. What she could not yet see was that the alliance forming between her and Madame Zhang would soon draw both of them into a conflict that reached beyond the walls of the Grand Imperial. A conflict that would test not only her loyalty, but the quiet strength she had learned to wield in a world that had tried, again and again, to make her invisible. The weight of what had begun between Nia and Madame Zhang was not something either of them could ignore. It was no longer simply about interpreting a few words or translating a page. It had grown into a quiet alliance, stitched together through glances, low-voiced conversations, and a shared understanding that neither of them truly belonged to the glittering world of the Grand Imperial. Still, Nia was careful. She carried herself as though nothing had changed, her uniform crisp, her movements deliberate and unhurried. But beneath that practiced calm, the corridors of the hotel had become something else for her, a maze filled with eyes and ears, each turn a choice between caution and exposure. The murmurs among the staff had not faded. They had sharpened. She felt it in the way conversations fell silent when she entered a room, in the sidelong glances traded between colleagues when her back was turned. It wasn't only jealousy anymore. It was suspicion, the kind that festered when people began to think someone might be playing a game they were not invited to. Even the front desk manager's presence had grown more deliberate, his polite comments now laced with the faintest hints of warning. Madame Zhang, however, seemed increasingly at ease with Nia. The older woman had a way of folding her presence into the room without demanding it, her voice soft yet firm, her eyes sharp with a kind of wisdom that made it clear she missed nothing. Their conversations grew longer, drifting from practical matters to personal ones, though never straying into sentimentality. And yet, through the simplest of exchanges, a bond had taken root. It was on a rainy afternoon that everything began to shift towards something irreversible. The storm had rolled in from the bay, the glass walls of the lobby streaked with silver lines of water. Guests lingered indoors, the staff stretched thin, and the atmosphere felt heavier than the weather itself. Nia had just finished turning down one of the executive suites when her radio crackled with a message. Madame Zhang was asking for her, and she wanted her immediately. When Nia arrived at the Magnolia Suite, she found the curtains drawn against the gray light, the room dim except for the warm glow of a table lamp. Madame Zhang sat in her armchair, an envelope in her hands. She gestured for Nia to sit. Without preamble, she passed her the contents. several sheets of paper, densely printed in Mandarin, bearing official seals and signatures. "This," Madame Zhang said slowly, "is what I came here for. And now I need to know if it is as dangerous as I suspect." Nia's eyes moved across the page, her mind working quickly to untangle the language. The documents were contracts complex, deliberate, with enough vague phrasing to be harmless in appearance and lethal in execution. They outlined the transfer of ownership for several properties in San Francisco, properties whose names Nia recognized from the city's older districts. But what caught her attention were the clauses buried in the text, provisions that allowed the current owners to retain control through a network of shell companies registered overseas. She looked up, meeting Madame Zhang's gaze. "This is not what it pretends to be. Whoever signs this loses everything, but they won't see it until it's too late." Madame Zhang's mouth tightened. "I thought so. And the people involved will do anything to make sure no one can challenge them." It was then Nia understood the full scope of what she had stepped into. This was no simple matter of helping a guest feel more comfortable. This was stepping into a current that could sweep her far from the safe, invisible life she had carved for herself. But it was also the first time in years she had felt her voice mattered in a place where it was meant to go unheard. They worked quietly, copying notes by hand, avoiding the hotel's electronic systems entirely. Every sound in the hallway felt amplified: the squeak of a cart's wheels, the muted knock of room service, the click of heels against the carpet. When the last page was translated, Madame Zhang placed a small jade ornament into Nia's palm. "For courage," she said simply. It should have ended there, but the Grand Imperial had a way of turning private moments into public currency. 2 nights later, Nia found herself summoned to the manager's office. The air inside was thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint trace of cologne. The manager's smile was polite, but his eyes were cold. "It's come to our attention," he began, "that you've been spending an unusual amount of time with one of our most valued guests. While we appreciate initiative, there are boundaries in place for a reason. You understand, I'm sure." She understood the words for what they were: a warning wrapped in civility. They wanted her to step back, to fade again into the background. But she also understood that if she did, she would be abandoning someone who had trusted her in a way no one else here ever had. That night, she returned to the suite once more. They spoke little. Instead, Madame Zhang handed her a sealed folder, light but heavy in meaning. "If anything happens, Ruiz," she said, "you must take this to the address inside. Do not tell anyone. Do not look back." The next morning the storm had passed, but the air in the hotel felt charged, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Staff moved with an edge to their steps. Guests spoke in lower tones, and the usual perfume of money and privilege seemed tinged with something more: acrid anticipation, or perhaps fear. By evening, the tension broke. A commotion erupted in the lobby, voices raised in rapid Mandarin and sharper English. Several men in tailored suits had arrived, their presence as jarring as the cold wind that swept in behind them. Nia recognized the cadence of their speech before she could catch the meaning, but when she did, her stomach tightened. They were here for Madame Zhang, and their words carried threats wrapped in legal formality. The hotel staff stood frozen, unable to understand or unwilling to intervene. The front desk manager looked from one face to another, his expression caught between confusion and the need to assert control. And then Madame Zhang turned her gaze across the room and called, in clear, steady Mandarin for Nia. Every head turned. The quiet hum of the lobby was replaced by a thick silence. Nia stepped forward, her heart pounding, aware that in this moment she was no longer invisible. She translated each word without faltering, her voice carrying both the precision of the language and the weight of the truth behind it. The men's expressions shifted as they realized their threats could no longer hide in the safety of being misunderstood. When it was over, the men left with tight jaws and clipped steps, their plans disrupted, their confidence rattled. Madame Zhang thanked Nia with a slight bow, a gesture that seemed to reverberate through the onlookers more than any words could. In the days that followed, the whispers in the corridors changed. Some still carried resentment, but others spoke with a note of something rarer respect. The front desk manager's gaze no longer held the same authority when it met hers. And though Nia returned to her duties, her cart rolling once again through the polished hallways, she knew the ground beneath her had shifted. She had not sought to unmask anyone, yet the mask had fallen anyway. Those worn by men who hid behind language to manipulate, those worn by staff who believed power was fixed, and perhaps even her own, the one she had worn for years to survive. And as she passed the grand mirrors lining the hall, she saw herself differently. Not as the invisible woman in a uniform, but as someone who had chosen, in a moment that mattered, to be seen. Subscribe for more stories like this. Check out the next video and share this one with friends.